Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who demands the keys to my house. I'll never forget the exact moment I realized my neighbor Karen wasn't just a busybody, but someone who crossed so many lines that I felt like I was living in a bizarre daytime drama. This whole saga started on a Sunday morning, right after I had finished hanging my newest painting in my small home-based gallery. I've been an avid painter for years, and though I'd never claimed to be a professional artist, I pour my heart and soul into every piece I create. That weekend, I was feeling particularly proud of this bright, abstract piece I just completed, and I had spent several hours deciding where it should go along my hallway gallery wall. Normally, I would keep my curtains closed whenever I was working, simply because I liked my privacy, and I wanted to fully immerse myself in my creative process. However, the morning was so pleasant that I'd left my living room drapes open to enjoy some much-needed sunshine. Karen is the type of neighbor who knows everyone's schedule, dietary habits, and the color of the pajamas they wear at night, even if they never step out to greet her. She lives in the house diagonally behind mine, perched on a slightly elevated plot of land that gives her a partial view of my backyard and a small angle into my living room if she tries hard enough, though it should really take some effort for someone to see that far inside my place. For months, I'd had a vague feeling I was being watched while I painted. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but sometimes I'd spot a flicker of movement from Karen's second-story window whenever I glanced outside to rest my eyes from detail work. A few times I'd convince myself it was just a curtain swaying or the reflection of a TV screen. Still, I'd started noticing odd little signs. For instance, while I might set up my easel near the window, Karen would have an uncanny knowledge of whatever color scheme I'd be working on. She'd occasionally bring it up in casual conversation. "Oh, your new painting is so blue, how calming," she'd say in that sugary tone of hers, even though I hadn't invited her over or posted any pictures. I tried chalking it up to her guessing or maybe seeing something fleeting if she happened to pass by, but deep down, her comments bothered me, and whenever she mentioned anything about the interior of my home, a small alarm bell went off in my mind. I just never had enough evidence to confront her about it, and I didn't want to be that neighbor accusing someone of peeping without proof. It all changed one day when Karen marched up to my front door like she owned the place. I was on my way to a local hardware store to pick up some wood stain, but as soon as I opened the door, there she stood, arms crossed, wearing a determined expression like she'd rehearsed a big speech. Without so much as a hello, she declared, "I need a copy of your house keys. Now let me tell you, I have never heard anything more bizarre." My confusion must have been obvious because she immediately launched into a long explanation about how she intended to let herself in to help with my housework when I got too busy with painting. She insisted she was doing me a favor. My jaw practically hit the floor. I still remember exactly how her eyes looked, glinting with a sort of smug confidence, like she truly believed she had every right to demand free access to my house. That boldness was unnerving. I tried to keep my composure, calmly reminding her that nobody had asked for her help with chores. Besides, I'm pretty particular about my space, especially since my paints, brushes, and canvases can get messy. I told her politely that I appreciated her concern, but I really didn't feel comfortable giving anyone a spare key. Karen's reaction was as if I'd told her she couldn't step on public sidewalks. She became outraged in an instant, her face turning a shade of red I didn't even know was humanly possible. She insisted that I needed her assistance, particularly with cleaning, because she claimed she knew how busy I got with my projects. And that's when her narrative took a turn for the even more unsettling. She said, and I'll never forget it, "Besides, I like to admire those paintings of yours. You have them in that little hallway outside the bedroom, right?" Instantly, my hair stood on end. Karen had never been in my home, and I'd never shared pictures of that narrow hallway where I hang all my pieces. Yet, she was describing it like she'd taken a personal tour of the space. When I asked her how she could possibly know the layout, she broke into a sly grin and remarked, "Oh, I've got a good vantage point from my second floor. Sometimes I just watch you put them up." She said it with absolutely zero shame, as if this was the most normal pastime a neighbor could have. Not once did it cross her mind that she was basically confessing to spying on me with binoculars. Naturally, I was stunned and appalled. In that moment, I didn't know if I should slam the door or outright tell her to get lost. Part of me was shaken, not just because she'd been peeping, but also because she'd built up this sense of entitlement, as though my life and my home were open for her to dissect and invade. Her confession explained those feelings of being watched, but didn't make me feel any better. I demanded to know why she thought using binoculars on a neighbor was acceptable behavior. I asked her if she realized she was crossing ethical and legal boundaries by peeking into my private space. Karen shrugged it off. She gave me a pointed look and retorted, "It's not my fault your windows are open. Don't you want your paintings to be seen?" I tried to keep my voice steady, letting her know that her use of binoculars was an invasion of privacy, plain and simple. That's when we got into a heated argument. Karen wouldn't back down, insisting that she was merely being neighborly, checking to make sure everything was fine. In her twisted logic, I was overreacting because if she was just concerned for me, how could it possibly be wrong? My adrenaline soared, but I realized something important. I was alone in my doorway with a person who could snap at any moment. So I ended the conversation by telling her firmly that I wouldn't give her keys to my house and that I did not give her permission to watch me or come onto my property without an explicit invitation. With that, I closed the door in her face. I hoped that she'd get the message and stay away, but wishful thinking got me nowhere. Later that day, I discovered footprints in the small strip of garden along the side of my house. I maintain a little herb patch there, rosemary, basil, thyme for my cooking. It's fenced off, but not with a tall fence, more like a half-foot barrier. The footprints were fresh, as if someone had tromped right through the garden. The next morning, I found more footprints, plus some leaves that looked intentionally parted, the kind you might push aside to peer through. That sense of being watched didn't abate. It heightened. At night, I'd sit in my living room, lights off, occasionally glance at my blinds, and sometimes I'd see a flicker of movement or a silhouette near the boundary fence. It was terrifying. I considered calling the police right away, but decided I should document more evidence in case Karen denied everything. The next day, I confronted her again, this time in a calmer manner. She stood on her porch, tending to some flowers. I tried to be polite, yet firm. I said, "Look, I don't care what you do on your property, but I am asking you politely not to step foot on mine without my permission." She pretended to be shocked, responding that she had no idea what I was talking about. Then, when I persisted, she brushed me off with a wave of her hand, smirking like I was some conspiracy theorist. She told me if I valued my privacy so much, maybe I shouldn't leave my windows uncovered. I wish I could say I remained calm, but I was fuming inside. I told her that if she continued, I'd take legal action. That was enough for her to threaten me right back, claiming she had friends on the local police force, though I knew for a fact she was bluffing since I'd never seen her around any local officials at block events or community meetings. After that confrontation, I decided to install a set of security cameras around the perimeter of my house. It was an expense I hadn't budgeted for, but I didn't see any other option. Karen's behavior kept escalating, and I refused to sit idle while someone trespassed on my property or spied on me with binoculars. The cameras gave me a little sense of relief, at least. I set them up in strategic spots covering the front walkway, the back gate, and the area around my herb garden on the side. By then, I'd also invested in a motion sensor floodlight that would turn on whenever someone passed through the side yard at night. I felt that combination was enough to catch Karen in the act if she dared step foot near my home again. Sure enough, my new security system didn't go unused for long. 2 nights later, my motion sensor floodlight flared to life. I was upstairs, reading before bed. My phone dinged with a notification from the camera app. Movement detected in the side yard. Heart pounding, I checked the live feed. There, plain as day, though it was nearly midnight, was Karen, creeping along my fence line. She had something in her hand, looked like a small pair of binoculars, ironically, and she was peering into my kitchen window. My blood ran cold. This was beyond curiosity or a simple misunderstanding. This was outright stalking. I gathered every bit of nerve I had and called the non-emergency police line to report her trespassing. It took about 15 minutes for an officer to show up. By the time the officer arrived, Karen had scurried back home. However, I had video evidence that clearly showed her on my property, lingering near my windows at an incredibly suspicious hour. The officer I spoke with was pretty understanding. He knocked on Karen's door, but she refused to answer. The officer took my statement, documented everything, and suggested I might want to consider a restraining order if her actions continued. I had half a mind to do so on the spot, but I decided to wait and see if the police visit would deter her. The next morning, Karen stormed over to my house. She banged on my door so hard I thought it might come off its hinges. When I opened it, chain-locked, mind you, she started screaming about how I was harassing her with my surveillance and that I was violating her right to walk around freely. It was so absurd, I almost laughed. She insisted she wasn't doing anything wrong by being in my yard at night, because in her words, the yard isn't fenced properly. How else am I supposed to take a shortcut? That's the logic she tried to pass off on me. I calmly told her that she was trespassing, that I had video proof, and that if she continued, we'd handle this in court. Karen's face twisted with rage. She threatened to call the police again, claiming I was the one engaging in criminal behavior. That same day, I got a call from a local officer. Apparently, Karen had tried to spin some story about me stalking her. Fortunately, the officer had my statement and footage from the night before. He told me not to worry, but to remain cautious. Over the next few weeks, Karen did not let up. She'd hover on the sidewalk just in front of my house, glaring at my cameras. When I left for grocery shopping, she'd follow me to my driveway, asking if I'd changed my mind about the spare key. She insisted again and again how I needed her to keep an eye on my place. Her repeated demands were borderline obsession. I'd grown so uneasy that I decided to talk to a friend of mine, Gavin, who dabbles in legal matters. He's not an attorney, but he's knowledgeable from a background in law enforcement. Gavin suggested gathering all the evidence, including each time she tried to force her way into my personal boundaries, any messages or notes, plus the footage from my cameras. He said that if I could show a pattern of harassment, I might have a strong case for either a restraining order or some form of legal consequence that would keep her off my property. While this was going on, I kept discovering new details that made me realize just how intrusive Karen's behavior had become. For instance, I noticed that my mailbox flag was left up on days I hadn't touched it. I have a habit of putting mail out in the morning, flipping the little red flag, and bringing it back down when I've collected everything in the afternoon. The flag being up at night indicated someone had been messing with my mail. After a couple nights of this, I positioned one of my cameras to cover the mailbox area. Lo and behold, Karen was caught on camera flipping the flag up in the middle of the night. She'd stroll past, glance around, and then flick the flag up as if she got some twisted pleasure from messing with me. It was such a weird action, one that would barely count as vandalism, but it further showed her willingness to intrude on my property in any way she could. Around that time, I also discovered that my fence gate lock, which I typically keep latched, would be mysteriously unlatched in the morning. Initially, I doubted myself. Maybe I forgot to lock it, but after the second or third time, I made it a point to triple check every single evening. And sure enough, some mornings, I'd find it undone. I installed another camera near the gate. One night, the footage revealed Karen leaning over from her side, reaching through a gap in the fence and lifting the latch. She never actually walked through, but just the act of unlatching it felt like another intimidation tactic. All of this tension started to take a toll on me. I had trouble focusing on my painting. Whenever I tried to work on a new canvas, I felt my creativity zapped by the fear that someone was lurking outside my window, peeping through binoculars. Friends began noticing I wasn't my usual cheerful self. I confided in them, explaining the bizarre neighbor situation. A couple of them offered to swing by more often, just to give Karen the impression that I wasn't alone and that people were watching out for me. I appreciated their support, but I still felt I needed a more official resolution. At some point, Karen escalated even further. She started leaving notes on my door, mostly scraps of paper with scribbled messages like, "You can't hide forever," and "Being neighborly means sharing your space," as if that would somehow make me cave in and hand over my keys. The final straw came when, in a fit of frustration, she called the police and claimed that I was harassing her with my cameras. I answered my door to an officer one afternoon who told me Karen filed a report stating I was pointing my camera directly into her bedroom. Thankfully, the officer realized the claim was baseless after I showed him my camera angles, all of which pointed at my own property. None of them even reached into her house. The officer listened to my side of the story, watched several clips showing her trespassing, and quietly indicated that I had a strong case if I wanted to pursue legal action. Enough was enough. I decided to file a restraining order against Karen, capturing all the evidence I had, from the footprints, the unlatching of my gate, her prowling at night, to the notes she left. Gavin helped me organize everything in a neat binder. It took some effort, and it wasn't exactly pleasant, but I couldn't live in constant anxiety. The day we went to court for the hearing, Karen showed up in a surprisingly cheerful mood, as if she believed the judge would automatically take her side. She tried to make it sound as though I was an unfriendly neighbor who was needlessly paranoid, but the moment I showed the judge the video clips, especially the one of her peering into my kitchen window after midnight, The mood in the courtroom shifted. When I testified, I mentioned how Karen demanded the keys to my home multiple times and how she'd never even been inside. Yet she described my paintings and the hallway where I hung them. I explained how she boasted about spying with binoculars. The judge looked appalled. Karen's defense was that it was a friendly neighborhood watch, but no one in the courtroom was buying it, especially once they saw her creeping around in the dead of night. Her explanations about simply checking on my security sounded downright delusional. Once the judge had reviewed everything, a severe penalty was handed down. Karen was given a restraining order that required her to stay at least 200 feet away from my property, effectively limiting her from snooping around my yard at night. On top of that, she was ordered to pay a hefty fine for trespassing, along with the court fees and some additional costs associated with my security system, which the judge deemed a direct result of her intrusive behavior. Karen's jaw dropped when she realized how serious the consequences were. Far from letting it go, she tried to argue that I was the one out of line. That didn't fly, especially with the evidence I provided. I wish I could say that was the end of the ordeal, but it took a while for Karen to finally get it through her head. One of the subplots that emerged in the midst of this fiasco involved an old property line dispute. My land extends a few feet beyond my back fence, and I had some leftover building materials stored there. A couple of old wooden planks and some gardening equipment. Karen claimed that small patch of land was hers. This was her justification for occasionally walking there at night to inspect it. I'd never thought much about that patch, since it was clearly on my side of the property line according to official records I obtained when I bought the house. However, she insisted that I had moved the boundary marker. In court, she tried to bring it up as a reason for why she was on my property. The judge wasn't having it, especially after seeing the property survey I provided, which clearly indicated the boundary. Her claim crumbled instantly. Meanwhile, I had a second subplot unfolding, one that unexpectedly helped reinforce my case. A local independent gallery had recently become interested in showcasing some of my artwork, and as part of that, I'd had a photographer come to my home to take pictures of my mini gallery. The photographer politely asked if I was okay with the shots, so we made sure to do it during daylight with the blinds open, letting in natural light. As we were taking pictures, Karen popped up at her window with her binoculars again, apparently curious to see the photographer. The photographer was startled and snapped a picture of Karen perched with binoculars pressed to her face. I didn't intend to use that photograph as evidence originally, but once Karen took things to court with her false claims, I realized how important it was to show that she was indeed blatantly spying on me at all times of day. The photo sealed the deal, as it proved that this was no one-time thing. The outcome of the restraining order also included a condition that Karen was barred from making direct contact with me. That meant no phone calls, no notes, and absolutely no stepping onto my driveway. She also had to attend a hearing about a month later where the final stipulations were to be reviewed. If she violated any of those conditions within that time frame, the consequences would be much more severe, possibly even jail time for harassment or stalking. I could see how livid she was when the judge announced it. The best part was that Karen couldn't talk her way out of it. She'd painted herself into a corner by calling the police so many times on me with baseless accusations. Even with all that, she tried one last desperate move. About a week before her next court date, she decided to call the police again, claiming I was shining floodlights into her windows just to torment her. Another officer came out and I showed him my floodlight's angle. It was positioned to illuminate my side yard if there was motion near the garden. There was no way it pointed anywhere near her windows. In fact, the distance was so great that the floodlight's beam barely reached the fence line. The officer left, clearly annoyed at yet another unfounded call. That incident was recorded in a police report, which I promptly forwarded to the court. When we met again in court, Karen had all these half-baked arguments about how I was causing her emotional distress with my security measures. The judge asked to see any evidence that my cameras or lights were directed onto her property. She had none. I, on the other hand, had a binder full of dated screenshots, recorded trespassing times, and the fresh police report about her false complaint. I felt a knot in my stomach the whole time, bracing for some unexpected twist, but nothing came. Once the judge heard my side and reviewed the evidence, Karen's arguments collapsed. She was slapped with a more stringent order, basically a full restraining order. prohibiting her from even being within visual range of my home unless she was driving past on the public street. She couldn't linger on the sidewalk or near my mailbox. The judge also made it clear that further false complaints to the police could result in criminal charges. After that final hearing, Karen disappeared from my life almost completely. I barely saw her, except for the occasional glance of her car driving away. She stopped standing at her window, presumably because she realized how quickly she'd land herself back in court if she tried anything. I'm not going to lie, it took me several weeks to stop looking over my shoulder or worrying if she was lurking nearby. Gradually, the tension faded and I was able to get back to my paintings. The sense of relief I felt was immense, like a dark cloud had finally been lifted. It might sound overdramatic, but the whole ordeal reminded me how vital it is to stand up for your rights, especially when it comes to your private property. Some people will push boundaries relentlessly unless you push back with the law. Karen's bizarre sense of entitlement had led her to believe she could do whatever she wanted. Watch me with binoculars, trespass at night, open my gate, toy with my mailbox, and even demand my house keys. But by documenting everything and using the legal system, I was able to show that her behavior was far from innocent. It was intrusive, threatening, and illegal. If there's one unexpected positive outcome from this whole mess, it's that I grew closer to a few other neighbors. Some folks down the street confessed they'd also had odd encounters with Karen, though nowhere near as extreme as mine. When they heard about my security upgrades, they decided to invest in their own cameras too. That small sense of community, where we look out for each other against anyone who might cross the line, has made me feel safer. Plus, I've learned a ton about property laws, restraining orders, and the importance of thorough documentation. Eventually, rumors circulated that Karen was moving away. I don't know the exact details, but I suspect the ongoing court restrictions were a huge hassle for her. She couldn't loiter in her own backyard without risking violation if she was too close to my boundary line. She couldn't wander around at night as she used to do. She seemed to be losing whatever power trip she'd been on, so maybe she decided it just wasn't worth it anymore. I saw a for sale sign pop up in front of her house a few months later. By that time, the situation had largely settled. I certainly wasn't going to shed any tears if she left the neighborhood. Months passed, and I never had any direct contact from Karen again. The final court hearing had laid down a clear path. Any further infractions, and she'd be in serious legal trouble. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she tried to claim she was bullied out of the neighborhood by me. But since that acquaintance also knew the real story, they didn't buy Karen's victim narrative for a second. Ultimately, she put her house on the market and disappeared to wherever it is that people with no concept of boundaries go. It's surreal to think back on how this all began. A supposed friendly neighbor requesting a spare key so she could help with my chores and admire my paintings. My initial confusion turned into horror once I realized she'd been spying on me, knew the layout of my hallway gallery, and had no qualms admitting that she used binoculars. Even now, I sometimes catch myself glancing out the window and half expecting to see her standing there, arms folded, binoculars in hand. But then I remind myself that the cameras are still up, the restraining order still stands, and she's not around to pester me anymore. I guess the moral, without sounding too cliched, is that if something feels off with a neighbor, it probably is. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to all those little red flags. The odd comments about the colors of my paintings, the glimpses of movement near her upstairs window, and her brazen walk through my herb garden. If I'd acted sooner, maybe I could have saved myself a lot of distress. Then again, I never imagined it would get so extreme that we'd end up in court over it. I monitored Karen's house after she listed it. When I wanted privacy, I kept my cameras rolling, locked my gates, and drew my blinds. I kept painting, exploring new themes to relieve stress. I painted a series inspired by my experiences. I didn't paint Karen, but I captured the feeling of being watched, intrusion, and reclaiming my space. The local independent gallery showed a small exhibition of my best work, which was surprising. Witnesses noted the tension, release, and personal empowerment. I didn't tell gallery visitors the backstory, but it was nice to know my art was touching them. I've learned that your right to home security shouldn't be underestimated. You either allow boundaries to be crossed, or you stand up. Standing up was scary, but I don't regret it. I now understand the importance of neighborly relations. Most neighbors are respectful, helpful, and keep their distance. However, obsession and entitlement must be limited. Having politely declined Karen's key request and moved on, would have prevented any issues. When she confessed to spying on me and demanded access to my home, it was clear this was no ordinary neighborly interest. After the incident, I reinforced my fence for security and peace of mind. The fence is taller and locks stronger. The cameras are still on, but they're not my only defense. Friends joked that I should post a sign saying, "Beware of the binoculars," referencing Karen's odd habit. We laughed about it. Relaxation came from laughter after months of tension. Interestingly, a family moved into Karen's house 4 months after she left. Their introduction was lovely, and they brought homemade cookies and politely asked if I didn't mind their construction noise. This was my first look at normal neighbor interactions. I was relieved and happy to avoid more drama. We even shared yard maintenance tips and local attraction suggestions. The difference was night and day from my hostility. After the dust settled, my life returned to normal, or a new normal. I'm growing my painting business. One weekend, I might host a small open house gallery for locals to see my paintings. However, my timeline and conditions will determine that. I talk to my new neighbors about lawn care and the farmer's market's best produce. Simple, peaceful life is what I want. Friends, thank you. See you soon.